introduce Peggy now and let her talk for 30 minutes or so, or however long she would like to. Peggy was a professor at Agnes Scott for 31 years. She doesn't look like she's old enough to have been a professor for 31 years, but she's Professor Emerita now, and she was the Ellen Douglas Laburn Professor of English at Agnes Scott, and her expertise was in 18th century and British literature. And she is still working and studying, and I understand she's writing some kind of book about the moral force in late 18th century British literature. And she stays very busy, and I'm impressed with that. But I want to share with you some of her personal life. She is from North Dakota, but she married a native Atlantan. And I'd like to hear the story of how she got to Atlanta sometime. But they raised 2 children. Her son is in Durham, North Carolina, and her daughter is here in Decatur, I believe. And they are both involved in early childhood learning. I know Peggy's very proud of them. And she has a grandson named Henry, and Peggy calls him Henry the Great. And I know he's a special young man. Peggy loves to cook, and she loves to listen to good music while she's cooking, all kinds of music. So she has a wide range of interests, not only in her profession of British literature, but in her life. And as I've told you earlier, I was an English major at Agnes Scott, and I have great affection for that department. And I know that Peggy has carried on that great tradition in her career and continues with her work today. So Peggy, we really, really appreciate you being here to tell us about Gulliver's Travels.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm very, very happy to be here. It's wonderful to see you again. Some of you probably don't know something I know about Carolyn, which is that she is an excellent dramatic reader. She volunteered to read from Austen's novels in our seminar, and she did a great job, although she was worried about Austen's characters having a Southern accent. It's good. I've seen other people from that seminar that I recognize. It's lovely to see you and everyone else I haven't met before. I'm sorry it's on Zoom, but better times are coming, I know. Okay, so Gulliver's Travels. It's a book that I have taught as much or more than any other single text in my career. I'm not a Swift scholar, but I have a lot of experience with this book, and it's one of those wonderful classics that keeps giving back. Every time I go to it, I see something new. And I want to share with you both some of what I've thought for a long time and some of what I'm thinking more recently. And I frame this in terms of the question, the subtitle, A Tale for Our Time. Is Gulliver's Travels still relevant to us, or is it just a kind of interesting curiosity? And one of the first things that I do when I approach a text is try to figure out what it is. You know, what kind of text is this? Because this is important in terms of knowing what kinds of questions to ask of it. And of course, for many of us, Gulliver's Travels is a tale for children. And there we have Henry the Great. This was taken coincidentally just this last summer. I'm reading an abridged version, one of the many abridgments for children. I think this was the very end of June of this year, and he's 5 years old, and he's interested. So there's that, right? But it's more. It's a children's tale, but only in an abridged version. Those of you who have read most or all of it know it's not suitable for children. It is also a fantasy, which is why it's appealing to children. But if you see that not so much as a children's fantasy, but an early example of science fiction, this is another context in which Gulliver's Travels is receiving increased attention. For a long time, it's been recognized as a parody of the early modern travel narrative, which was a genre growing very rapidly in popularity at the time Swift was writing this book. And many of us who studied it in school, and I can't believe, Carolyn Curry, that you did not. I'm just shocked. Not even in the British survey, 212? No? Okay. Most of us read it or have been taught that it is a political and cultural satire of Swift's world, and it certainly is that. And we've also usually been taught that it's an examination more generally of human nature and human potential for good and evil. Just how far can we go in either direction? And certainly, I would say, yes, it's all these things. And I'm going to touch on the latter two most in this presentation, but I'm also going to share with you at times a more recent way of identifying Gulliver's Travels or categorizing it. And this is what I mean when I say that the book just keeps interesting me in new ways. And that is as a very discomforting representation of the colonial imagination. It's discomforting because in Gulliver's Travels, we are very subtly led to assume the perspective not of the European colonizer, but of the people colonized, subjugated, and sometimes enslaved. And this is a piece with Swift's general dissatisfaction with many features of modernity, meaning post-medieval, right? This is early modern period. So I might be using a term, the colonial project, which is a big component of this pursuit of new knowledge, accomplishments, wealth, power. And it is, as we increasingly recognize and admit, heavily dependent on the exploitation, subjugation, enslavement of the other, non-European peoples. And Gulliver's Travels, as I mentioned, prompts readers to identify with the latter, even if they don't fully realize what they're doing. And it's one of the reasons people don't like Gulliver's Travels, because it makes them feel uncomfortable, and I think this is a big part of it. Okay, first, some context. Gulliver's Travels was published in 1726. At that point, Swift had been in exile, paradoxically, in his native country since 1714. And the sense that he felt he was in exile comes from his sort of deep-seated ambivalence toward Ireland. He was born there, but to English parents. He was educated there. He spent a lot of time in England, including a very important period for him from 1710 to 1714. He was then writing for Queen Anne, so he was very close to the power of the British or the English throne. But he fell out of favor with Anne because of his sometimes coarse means of expression. And this is allegorized in part one of Gulliver's Travels in that wonderful scene in which Gulliver awakes to cries of alarm, fire, there's a fire in the Empress's chamber, and he, having had quite a bit of wine that evening, rushes to put out the fire by urinating on it. And instead of being grateful, the Queen can only resent him for the rest of his stay on Lilliput. So this is an allusion, one of many in Swift's works, including Gulliver's Travels, to ingratitude on the part of powerful people. He felt very unappreciated, and it just stung and stayed with him. Now, worse than this, by 1726, a German had been on the throne, the English throne, for 14 years. 12 years. In 1714, Anne died, not long after she sent Swift away. And the closest Protestant successor happened to be from the House of Hanover in Germany. So here comes George I, speaks very little English, not particularly interested in England, and that creates a power vacuum, which gives rise to some, what we would pretty much see as familiar modern politics, a lot of wheeling and dealing, a lot of transactions. In other words, things done not because one believes they're the right thing to do or the best thing to do, but they're done in exchange for something else that one wants done. And the master of this was a man named Robert Walpole. Swift hated him. Walpole managed to be the chief minister from 1721 to 1742, 20 years of tremendous power. And he was just really good at negotiating political IOUs, collecting them and then calling them in. And his policies were consistently what we would call Whig policies, primary of which was a very aggressive pursuit of wars that financially drained the landed gentry, but financially benefited the new commercial class that wanted trade routes open or protected. And of course, this is closely related to what we're calling the colonial project. Swift was especially concerned about threats to the established church. And this is where he and Anne were really in close conjunction. She was somewhat Whiggish in her pursuit of war, but she agreed with Swift that there should be no religious freedom, no religious toleration of anything other than the Anglican religion. Swift would say, and he says something like this in part 1 of Gulliver's Travels, it's one thing to keep poisons for your own use, but it's quite another to, to vend them as if they're cordials. So if you believe something else, keep it to yourself. But any kind of open practice of a competing religion, Swift thought was just plain foolish and destructive. And then he was very upset too by modern systems of thought, philosophy, all kinds of things that were being perceived and celebrated as improvements and progress. And he saw it as just a degeneration away from humanity's highest points of civilization. So he was absolutely maddened, crazed by the pride that he saw around him, people taking in these so-called improvements when he thought it was just a horrible set of circumstances. And he is known, of course, for what we see hear and read as a kind of crazed tone, including in parts of Gulliver's Travels. And that's partly what Anne was offended by, that he just was so upset by what he saw going on around him. And sadly, he died with things even worse from his point of view. Everything that he believed in had been weakened or erased. So it is a kind of sad personal story for him as well. Okay, so we're certainly going to be talking about Gulliver's Travels as a satire. And I borrowed here a definition from Penguin Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory, just to remind us of what that might include. The satirist is a kind of self-appointed guardian of standards, ideals, and truth, of moral as well as aesthetic value. He takes it upon himself to correct, censure, and ridicule the follies and vices of society, and thus to bring contempt and derision upon aberrations from a desirable and civilized norm. Thus, satire is a kind of protest, a sublimation and refinement of anger and indignation. And Ian Jack, who wrote a very important book about satiric literature in the 18th century, wrote, "Satire is protest become art." You could argue that it's not so refined in Swift's case, but certainly we can recognize the anger and indignation. Now, generally, the satiric method in Gulliver's Travels is one of radical disorientation. That is, he dislodges our current perspective by putting us in fantastic worlds. And in parts 1 and 2, those are worlds in which he manipulates scale to disorient us. And once we're disoriented, once we lose our old perspective, then the idea is we're more capable of seeing things in a different way. We're capable of being corrected by the satirist. So this is generally what Swift is up to. Now, if we go to Lilliput, the first of our voyages, we'll see that disorientation if we think about the ways in which the Lilliputians view Gulliver and his possessions. Let me just read you very quickly a description from the Lilliputian point of view. They say, or Gulliver says, that there arrived at the court and expressed to inform his majesty that some of his subjects riding near the place where I was first taken up had seen a great black substance lying on the ground, very oddly shaped, extending it at its edges round as wide as his majesty's bedchamber, and rising up in the middle as high as a man, that it was no living creature, as they had at first apprehended. For it lay on the grass without motion, and some of them had walked round it several times, that by mounting upon each other's shoulders they had got to the top, which was flat and even, and stamping upon it they found it was hollow within, that they humbly conceived it might be something belonging to the man mountain, and if his majesty pleased, they would undertake to bring it with only 5 horses. Okay, so what we've got here is their description of Gulliver's hat, right? And in addition to disorienting us, saying, wait a minute, what is that, right? We're also amused. We smile because they don't recognize what a hat is. And when they do see it, excuse me, they don't recognize what a hat is when they see it. And because they need 5 horses to convey it, and because they seem so proud that they can convey it with only 5 horses. So in other words, we see an example of what we see repeatedly in this part, which is that the Lilliputians are limited in their power and their knowledge, and certainly their pride in that power and knowledge. And then we recognize that we are not so different. That in many ways, we too are little people with no reason to be proud. Now, one of the ways in which we recognize what is wrong with the Lilliputians is by comparing them with Gulliver, whose physical superiority is parallel to his moral superiority. Remember, he doesn't crush them when he has an opportunity to grab up a handful and dash them to the ground. He doesn't do it. When he's tormented by the men who try and stick their swords or poles or whatever it was in his nose and make him sneeze, he argues that they should not be punished harshly. And most significantly, he refuses demands that he help the emperor to absolute dominion over Blefuscu, the rival kingdom. So he is superior. Now, his judgment on the Lilliputians is not always explicit. Often he and Swift, by extension, comment indirectly by understatement and irony. And I love this about him. For example, he's describing the emperor. The emperor is taller by almost the breadth of my nail than any of his court, which alone is enough to strike an awe in the beholders. That strikes awe. Okay. He doesn't have to say anything, right? He just says, just describes. Now he's also, of course, doing this very thing in more important matters. Swift has Gulliver describe, for example, and very importantly, the political targets that he has in mind, so that you might remember how favorites are determined and power is distributed in Lilliput. It's by how well they dance on a rope, right? How well they please a vain ruler. It's a kind of performative supplication, right? They are most literally jumping through hoops. And this emperor is vulnerable to that because he is so vain. And the result is a court that is absolutely pervaded by corruption, treachery, cruelty, ambition, and of course, ingratitude, right? And we see this culminating in the emperor's demand that Gulliver utterly subjugate his enemies and his cruel reaction when Gulliver refuses. Remember, one of the plans, well, maybe we can just put out his eyes and still have his strength, right? This is an example of wanting blind power, right? You're here to do what I say. You should not have any opinions of your own. And what I want is for the absolute subjugation of this other kingdom. Okay, so clearly Gulliver is superior, but there are exceptions to this general rule. One is that chapter 6 in this part, which confuses a lot of people, is a description of what the Lilliputians used to be. And it's in fact a kind of utopia. For example, not only is crime punished, but virtue is rewarded. And ingratitude is a capital crime. Now, this is very Swiftian, right? And this goes on and on. So that is confusing, but it's not the Lilliputians as they are now. The other big exception is that although Gulliver's size may give him superior strength, it also gives him a kind of grossness, right? He's gross. He's so big. And he's always worried about where he's going to have a bowel movement and then what everyone's going to do with it. And you get this images of wheelbarrows full of his dung. And that is, at least in part, a reminder on Swift's part that no matter how accomplished we think we are still animals, at least partly animals with animal functions. And he's just kind of shoving it in our faces. Now, there's another example of his big body and the focus on it. Gulliver poses as a kind of colossus. Remember when he stands astride the street and the little Lilliputians process underneath him? And it's important because his pants are worn. So when they look up, they see these giant genitalia. Okay, now on the one hand, this might be very impressive, right? But on the other, it recalls a fearful fascination with the allegedly outsized nether parts of those who were enslaved or otherwise subjugated by European colonizers. There was always this fascination and allegation. So that this is not a random image on Swift's part. He's tapping what is already being said in colonial discourse. And that leads me to my fourth point on this slide, which is that for all of his moral and physical superiority, he is threatened. He is constantly the object and the victim of this kind of cruel perspective. From the moment he wakes up, bound to the ground in that iconic image, Gulliver is the object of physical injury, disrespect, restraint, confinement, exploitation, objectification, vulnerability, display, and betrayal. People refuse to see him, especially the emperor, as anything other than his labor. And so when he resists, then he becomes nothing more than this giant carcass to be disposed of. You know, well, we could kill him, but then what would we do with him, right? So insofar as we identify with Gulliver as opposed to the little people, we're suddenly caught. Instead of feeling superior, we're feeling vulnerable ourselves. Now, Gulliver assimilates to some degree to his tormentor's perspective. And you can see this in comic ways. You remember he is named a Nardak, and he's so proud of being a Nardak, right? A tiny little nardak. And what's even funnier, I think, is when he feels very indignant and thinks he has to defend the honor of a Lilliputian lady whom he is accused of having an affair with. Well, remember, this woman, right, is 1/12 his size. I don't know what they thought he was doing, but it's, he's forgetting, right, in a literal, comic, physical way, right, about his perspective as a giant. But metaphorically, it's, of course, he's just generally forgetting that his perspective is not the Lilliputians. So this is a very comic thing here, I think. But as the novel proceeds, you're going to see this idea of assimilation become increasingly severe and significant and tragic, finally, by the end of the book. Okay. So on we sail to Brobdingnag, right? And the terms of the satire reverse. Whereas Lilliput is largely, although not exclusively, a satire of British politics, Brobdingnag is largely an image of a utopian society modeled on Roman and Spartan principles, ancient, not modern, of utility, simplicity, and honesty. So in other words, Gulliver's small physical size now mirrors his moral inferiority. And this comes out in any number of ways, but I wanted to stress the king's conversations with Gulliver. This is in chapter 6. He gets so offended by everyone condescending to him and, laughing at the fact that he comes from a whole culture that has all the things that he thinks he should be proud of. And so finally the king says, okay, well then convince me, right? Tell me about where you come from and your people. And so Gulliver describes England in very idealistic terms, right? And lets us as readers compare that with reality. So he's saying all the nobility are educated to be virtuous and self-sacrificing and noble and so on. And we're sitting there saying, wait a minute. And he does this, all the positions of authority in the church and the court are earned through moral integrity and so on. And we're saying, wait a minute. Okay. Then he adds another layer to this satire because the king suggests potential problems. He goes, wait a minute, wouldn't it be possible not to educate the nobility this way? Wouldn't it be possible to allow them to become idle and self-indulgent and therefore not good leaders? And we see that these are real problems, not just potential problems. And then the king wonders at things that aren't even deemed problems by Gulliver, and these are all Whig policies. So the king says, what do you mean you've got a national debt? What do you mean you've got wars in other countries, that you're traveling to other countries and invading for the purposes of commerce? Why do you have standing armies, factions and sects and political parties? And why in the world do you have a religious liberty? So he says all that. And then finally, we get to the king putting in his own words what Gulliver has said. And it reminds me a little bit, I don't know if any of you are on Twitter, but sometimes people say, now let me get this straight. And then they'll say something that points out the absurdity of what's just been said. But I'm going to read just the very end of this critique where he summarizes in his own words everything that Gulliver has told him. And he says, and Gulliver has tried to make it sound as good as he can. But at the end, he says, Gulliver, I'm well disposed to hope you may hitherto have escaped many vices of your country because you've been traveling so much. But by what I have gathered from your own relation and the answers I have with much pains wringed and extorted from you, I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature has ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. Okay. All right. So there are exceptions to the Gulliver's inferiority and the Brobdingnagians' superiority in this part, just as there were exceptions to the reverse in part 1. For example, now it's the Brobdingnagians that have the big, gross bodies. And this is especially true. And those are, again, meant to be seen as human bodies, you know, reminding us. And this isn't surprising when he sees the poor beggar or the man with the cancer on his neck or the object of a public execution shooting blood out of fountains. But you notice he's even sickened by a mother nursing, you know, one of the archetypal positive images in Western iconography. Or the real kicker is, remember how he is, I would say allowed, but he's really forced to be in the company of these beautiful young late maids in waiting when they're dressing and undressing when they're naked. One of them even puts him on her nipple and has him ride. And this is not a fantasy for him. This is not beauty or a sexually arousing. He is utterly uninterested and disgusted. Okay, so the Brobdingnagian bodies, again, a reminder of what is not so attractive about our own bodies. And then the other big exception is Gulliver's first master, the farmer, who is very cruel to him, very selfish, and exploits him as a kind of freak, right? Shows him for his own profit until he thinks he's going to kill him, and then agrees to sell him to the king and queen. But Gulliver's problems are hardly over once he gets to court and is free of this farmer master. If you think about it, he is never recognized as a human being. He's a thing, he's a creature, he's an embryo, he's a piece of clockwork, he's a doll, he's a sex toy, he's a freak of nature. He is an entertainment. And most repeatedly, he is an animal. First time a Brobdingnagian sees him, he picks him up and puts him down, or attempts to put him down on all fours, right? The farmer's wife reacts as if he's a toad or a spider. Woo, get that thing out of here. Even Glumdalglitch, the little girl who is his nurse and loves him, compares him to her pet lamb. And he's threatened repeatedly by other small animals over and over again. Remember that he has a battle with a rat? Can you imagine a rat 12 times the normal? You know, he thinks he's pretty heroic in defeating this vicious rodent with his hanger or sword. But just like Swift, he has the maid come up when the battle is over, pick up the rat with tongs and throw it out the window. You know, he doesn't have to say anything. He just says, what you think is heroic, someone else might see as an annoyance, right? Now the animal comparisons and identifications really get intense, both when the king says your people are the odious vermin, right? But also when Gulliver is snatched up by a mother monkey who thinks she is his offspring. And remember, she takes food out of her cheek and shoves it into his mouth. It really is disgusting. Now, the fact that he is identified with a monkey, again, is not a random image. Already by 1726, peoples who were being subjugated by Europeans were being compared frequently to monkeys and apes. And so again, Gulliver is in all this suffering and humiliation, evoking the perspective of the non-European. And I was going to call your attention to one other image in that respect. Do you remember there's a point at which the queen takes a golden ring off her finger and puts it around his neck? I don't know if you remember that, but I pointed out because this is, can you see that? I think that one might be silver, but it was very common for noble women to have, they were sort of servants, but they were also kind of exotic pets, possessions, you know. And they would have these gold, or in this case, silver collars, which were both ornamental, but also a reminder that they're slaves, that they're an animal in a collar. So let me see if I can get the next one. Yeah. This one's a little harder to see, but I pointed out because it's so often the case that these portraits are taken with these women, like the queen. And the small slave boy, usually boy, will have this collar on, like Gulliver's. Here's another one that's a little bigger, and I think it's helpful because you can see the collar, first of all, right? And you can see he's one of 3 pets. There's the boy, there's the dog he's holding, and there's the exotic parrot. And there's so many like this. Swift would have been aware of them. And we could do a whole thing on that, which is fascinating in itself. So Swift, again, is drawing on colonial discourse, colonial images. It's not just a coincidence that these things are coming up. So now, before we go to the land of the Winhams, let me just remind you that it's in Brobdingnag that Gulliver refuses to do, or offers to do the very thing he refuses to do in Lilliput. Did you notice that? He will not help the Lilliputian emperor totally subjugate the Blefuscuans, but he offers, unasked, to the king of Brobdingnag the power of gunpowder, so that he can have dominion over anyone he wants. And the king, as a kind of idealistic and ideal ruler, is horrified. Now, a lot of times people will say, and I for many years said, well, this is just an inconsistency in his character, because Gulliver is really a satiric device. He's not primarily a literary character. I see it totally different now, thanks to some scholars who have pointed this, this process out to me. It is consistent and credible because of his debasement. In other words, he is defensively attempting to side with the power that is oppressing him, attempting to ingratiate himself with those who have so much power over him. Okay. And you'll note that the assimilation is so extreme in this part that he can't recognize himself in a mirror when he gets home, right? That's a mark of how much he has assimilated to a different point of view. So here we are, finally, in the last voyage to the land of the Winhams. And again, we've got lots of similarities with parts 1 and 2. Again, we're disoriented by being put in a very strange environment. Again, the new perspective that gives us is sharpened and developed through a series of comparisons with other very different creatures. Again, he relies heavily on sensory images. You know, if it's not the emperor being proud of being a nail's width taller than others, here it's the very disgusting descriptions of the Yahoos, and the sense that is most emphasized in this part. Did you notice? It's smell. The Yahoos stink, and we're always being told that they stink. So, and again, we get a description, an extended description of Gulliver's world as he tries to account for it in talking to these new creatures. This time, but he's not trying to idealize it and smooth over the shortcomings and the parts that embarrass him. Instead, he's quite honest, brutally honest. He says, he explains that our reasons for war are so ridiculous, that we abuse our reason in order to create instruments of war, that we use money, which the Winhams don't have, in order to feed our avarice, that we pursue luxury and international trade to appease women's whims. We'll go back to that. That we abuse wine and are frequently intoxicated and forfeit our reason, that we have many self-inflicted causes of unnecessary illnesses, that physicians, like attorneys, are corrupt frauds, that politics is dominated by self-interest, the nobility, our leaders, are raised to be idle and corrupt, And all of this leads to the Wyndham's conclusion. And you may remember it is that if your people are yahoos with a pittance of reason, you use it only to exacerbate your vice. So that judgment, that point of view extends Gulliver's humiliation even more. Now, it's true that he is treated somewhat like those slaves in those pictures, in that he's a kind of special one, right? He's the exception. He's the pet. He is in some ways a prodigy. But he cannot escape his identity with the yahoos in that famous scene in which he has stripped to swim in the lake or the river, and he is attacked by a female yahoo who tries to mate with him. That's who he is. Okay. Differences. That tone, it's getting harsher and harsher, isn't it? It's not fun anymore. It's not the children's book anymore. The generality, it's not just about Robert Walpole anymore. It's about human nature. It's about what distinguishes us from other creatures, that makes us so proud. Is it the trappings of human artifice, such as clothing? The minute we take them off, we are a yahoo? Is it our reason, which we apparently only abuse to do yahoo-like things? And in asking these questions, Swift is using double comparisons this time. Instead of comparing Gulliver with one other group of different kinds of creatures, he is comparing with both. One, all beast ruled by selfish passion, and one, all reason, lacking human passion, including the love for particular individuals, grief, fear, and so on. And then finally, in part 4, his assimilation is just so complete that he never recovers his ability to see himself and other humans accurately. You notice that Swift has him rescued by a very un-Yahoo-like captain, Mendoza, very kind, right? Very gentle. And Gulliver makes a fool of himself by refusing to be anywhere near him. And more comically, he cannot stand to be around his own family when he gets home unless he's got his nose stuffed with rue and other herbs to prevent him from smelling the Yahoo. So Gulliver ends the book what I would call overcorrected. Not only is he not proud, but he's disgusted and wants nothing to do with human beings. And I think this is Swift's way of distancing himself from that very position. Tempted as he is by his own fury and disgust with what human beings are capable of, he projects that onto Gulliver and escapes it himself. Okay, and then finally, the last difference, I think, in this part 4 is that we've really got the most extended development of this colonial perspective, and we have it in the form of the Wyndhams. Some people have noticed that the Yahoos are described as flat-nosed or with droopy breasts. And again, Swift is drawing from colonial discourse, specifically colonial voyage literature. And he's been called racist for using these images, but I think they are part of his larger concern to attack the Wyndhams as racists themselves. So you think about it, objectification and commodification of the Yahoos extends not just to their labor, but their skin. The tallow from their bodies is used for products, right? It's an extreme dehumanization that is made possible by the fact that the Wyndhams can only see difference as lack. So instead of saying, in Gulliver's case, he has a different kind of nose, Gulliver lacks our prominent nose, right? Instead of saying Gulliver relies on two legs and opposable thumbs and so on, it's Gulliver lacks 4 strong legs and feet. They also say they can't believe Gulliver comes from a country full of sort of exceptional yahoos like himself. In other words, he doesn't even have his own culture, history. He's simply without, just as the yahoos are. Remember, they supposedly couldn't possibly be indigenous to the land that the Houyhnhnms now control. They're without history. But even so, the Houyhnhnms seem to be guilty enough, or feel guilt enough, that they fear a revolt of the yahoos, especially when led by someone like Gulliver, an exceptional yahoo. Right? And this is why Gulliver has to leave, or in large part has to leave. And also we see that they have these regular meetings to decide whether they should exterminate the yahoos, genocide, right? And they have no self-knowledge. They can't see anything wrong with themselves. They can only see the nastiness of those they oppress, right? Okay, the other, right? And then finally, there's this huge disconnect in the Houyhnhnms between the civility and the harmony of their domestic life. Remember the gray sorrel, I think it is, that sort of adopts Gulliver and tries to protect him. It's all peaceful, harmonious, right, and civil in the domestic. And then there is this exploitation and inequity that is sort of walled off. Virtue is defined here, and this is something else entirely. And that was a very 18th century development, the increased domestication of virtue. And women were assigned to play a big role in that. The home then became the locus of virtue as opposed to the public life of heroic men. And women were the guardians of virtue. Okay, so all of this is to say that I think Swift saw creatures like the Houyhnhnms in part as just another part of modernization, magnifying the worst faults of humankind, especially Europeans. It doesn't contradict earlier readings, but it sharpens and focuses it in this way, and is very consistent with his distaste for all things modern. So I will conclude with no conclusions, just some questions. Is Gulliver's Travels a tale for our time? Is it still speaking to us? And if so, what are we hearing? Do we currently resemble the Lilliputians or the Brobdingnagians or the Yahoos or the Houyhnhnms? And which resemblance should we fear most? The end.
You touched on the fact that Gulliver seemed obsessed with details about clothing. And what do you think Swift is? Is he playing on that old adage that clothes make the man, to show that Gulliver lacks a strong personal identity and doesn't feel comfortable in his own skin?
I love the way that's put. Yeah, you could do a whole talk on just the clothing. In each part, the way in which his clothing is manufactured or viewed is another way for Swift to reveal something about these new people and new cultures. But also clothing is always a focus for travel literature, because clothing wears out. And adventurers, whether they're fictional or not, have to make do. And it becomes important. Swift published this, I'm trying to think, I think it's about 7 years after Robinson Crusoe, right? Another great travel narrative. And Robinson Crusoe has to make clothing out of goatskin. But the really, I think, significant thing for Robinson Crusoe and for Swift too, is that the clothing, but they're coming from very different points of view. The clothing is supposed to be a way of distinguishing us from savages. That nakedness is no longer innocence, it is sinfulness and savagery. And so the attention to the clothing is part of that examination on Swift's part of what makes us different from animals, savages, whatever we want to call non-human, and should we really be so proud of it?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I was taken aback when I think in part 4 that he actually said something about something being made out of the skin of the yahoos or of his cloth, you know, and you go, what? But you think about the skin of all these other animals that are used for clothing. And if yahoos are considered animals, you would use the skin of the yahoo too. So,
and people have pointed out that this anticipates in a horrible way the use of some so-called animal products of the victims of the Holocaust.
Oh.
Yeah, wow. Once a creature is not human, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
It opens a floodgate.
Exactly. So sobering. Well, and why did you skip part 3?
Because I already talked too long. Now, part 3.
Is it related to the others?
Absolutely. I mean, you can find all the same themes, but it's very, very different. It takes much longer to unpack. It was written after the other 3, so that these 3 were written as a kind of sequence. He goes to 4 or 5 different lands there, and develops some variations on a theme. He talks more about modern learning, abstract learning, and that kind of thing. But it's just too much.
You've given us a lot to think about, to say the least.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, it's been wonderful. And as I said, I don't know how I missed Gulliver all these years. And certainly the version that we have through the cartoon is not at all accurate. You know, Disney destroyed so much of it, but obviously they couldn't include all of it. And it's so complex. And it's so interesting that the word Yahoo has come down to, and we hear it all the time. And but I didn't even realize it came from Gulliver's Travels. I'm confessing my ignorance. You know, I switched out of English and became a history major when I went to graduate school. But it is really fascinating. And this is my question. Since Swift was dean of, he was an ordained clergyman and dean of St. Patrick's, I understand, in Ireland, he doesn't talk about religious belief and God. And, you know, this part, and I'm a historian, and I know that there was so much about Catholic and Protestant and all that going on at that period. Like Queen Anne died, and that's the reason the Hanoverians came in, because they were Protestants from Germany. And he doesn't really get into that much, does he? I mean, he alludes to the clergy being
corrupt, like everyone else.
What did they believe? Did they believe in a higher power, or did they believe in that? I did think about that.
Yeah. No, he doesn't explicitly address this much, except that one passage in part 1 where he says, you know, don't vent your poison as if it were cordials. You know, right? If you're not a true believer, keep your mouth shut. But mostly it's implicit. In his kind of religion, this sort of pride is utterly inappropriate. This belief in progress, man-made progress, right, is really in some ways threatening religious teachings as well as disrespecting ancient learning, and he was an adherent of both. His allegiance with Anne was really on this issue. He was high church, high Tory, Anglican church only, no toleration, no dissent. And that's where they really had a meeting of the minds. But you're right, he doesn't bring it up explicitly much at all. Except I think it's motivating some of his positions.
But I think writers had to be very careful about expressing religious belief. They were walking on thin ice, and they a lot of times were careful about that. But I mean, obviously, he's not careful about very much. But I was just wondering about that. And he published it anonymously, and it was so controversial. And I guess when he finally came out and owned it, I was just wondering what the response was after he owned it. I mean, was he endangered in any way or anything like that? His position?
No, no. People who didn't like it, and it didn't like it for the coarseness. They didn't like it because they thought he was representing the humans as yahoos. I don't read it that way. And if I were going to be depressed about something, it would be humans as Winhams. But it was more a question of the sort of depressing image in part 4. But he himself said something really good about this. It was very popular, even though there were criticisms like this. And he said, satire is a looking glass in which people can see everyone but themselves. And that's why it's popular, because no one ever takes the criticism personally. They always
That's right. He's talking about the other person, not me. Okay. And you've talked about, we heard you speak about Jane Austen, and I'm sure, do you think that Swift was an influence on Austen in any way?
You know, that is so fascinating, isn't it? I mean, because they were both, had well-defined moral sensibilities, were Anglicans and so on. But you never hear about, what you hear about is a kind of his or her relationship with what I would call a middle term, and that's Samuel Johnson, who saw a lot of Swift in himself, but he said, "There, but for the grace of God go I." Didn't, you know, Swift ended his life in an asylum, and he left his estate to the insane. I mean, when I say he's crazed, I mean, this world drove him crazy. He also had some other physical ailments that were tormenting him too. So you can see a connection between Austen and Johnson, and through that, perhaps to Swift. But of course, Austen is anything but coarse.
Yes.
So proper. She's so indirect. She's so measured, except her very early work, when she is writing as a teenager, a young teenager. It's what everyone called, you know, people are surprised when they read it. It's very dark, it's very coarse. And then she, as it were, kind of cleaned up her act when she was ready for publication. But she had that strain in her, you know. I don't know, and I honestly never seen anything about Swift and Austen.
Well, and I'll just let you say a little bit, this will be our last question. And you've given several examples, but how did he feel specifically about women? Did he see them? I was noticed how he was very hierarchical. He had the king, he had the master, he had the nobility, and then he talked about the laborers, and everybody seemed to have an assigned role. And, you know, I guess he saw women with their assigned roles usually. Didn't see women very favorably.
No, there are lots of books about this one. And just as you say, he does believe in this kind of hierarchy. He's classist, right? So that everyone should be treated well, but they should be educated for their station, not to aspire to move up. And hence the responsibility of the nobility to really live up to their station. But then it's like, oh yeah, and then the women, right? This happens all the time, where the women are an afterthought. he's talking about people, and then there's the women. He's talking about Lilliputians, and then there's the women, right? And the women are almost always characterized as trivial, superficial, selfish, hysterical, and very carnal, right? If it's not a woman, if it's not a Yahoo attacking him or luring other Yahoos behind her, there's this famous scene in part 3, which we didn't read, in which this woman leaves this fine household in one land and prefers the life of a kind of common prostitute in another, living in a gutter, because that's what women are, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and he said, I'm sorry to say that women's nature is no different there than here, or something. Yeah, it's all. That's not a good place to end. I'm sorry.
Just one last thing, was he ever married to anybody?
Swift?
Yeah.
No.
No.
He
Okay.
he proposed to a woman and then withdrew the proposal.
Okay.
The great love of his life was someone much younger than he, the daughter of a housekeeper he met when she was 8.
Oh my.
And it was not sexual. It was not pedophilia. It was what someone called impassioned discipline or something. I mean, he was comfortable in this role of being kind of a mentor, teacher, father. But she was the Stella that he wrote poems to. He wrote a journal to Stella, and he wrote the most wonderful poems to Stella. And the last one he wrote when he knew she was dying makes me cry every time I read it. I could barely teach it. So there was some tenderness there, but it was, of course, unusual.
Well, he was quite a writer. He was so good about detail. I mean, you know, it was a fantasy, but you got into it so that you felt like you were there. Well, I'm sorry that we can't answer all the questions. We don't have time for that, but we've had a lot of good information given to us, and we've gotten quite a few questions in. But thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I hope if I do come back, it will be in person.
Okay, yes, let's keep our fingers crossed.
Yes, and I hope you all stay well.
Okay, thank you very much, Peggy.
Thank you.